Welcome to Rower LLC's webinar, When Families Come Together, So Do Conversations, Navigating Prenups, Estate Planning, and Divorce this holiday season. Essentially, we are here to talk about some do's and don'ts and other tips on how to approach difficult conversations to have effective outcomes. But really, it's at any time of the year. So the genesis of this program was in recognizing that the holidays may present opportunities, but also some challenges in the areas that we generally help our clients through. So for example, the holidays may present an opportunity to slow down and engage with family around important issues of estate planning, for example. Issues that, in our busy lives, we often keep us from sitting down with family and just having those conversations, right? But perhaps you and your spouse are in the process of moving toward divorce or having conversations around a postnuptial agreement. So navigating those early conversations with each other may be particularly hard around the holiday season when emotions may be heightened and there are family traditions in the works, and family, including in-laws and friends, are more often around in a very short period of time. And that can add a lot more tension and difficulty to the conversation. So this may be a time where you want to tread a bit more cautiously when you are engaging in these conversations and figuring out the when and the where and the how to effectively communicate around these issues during this time of the year. So that's the background of why we're all here tonight. So let me give you a brief introduction into Rower LLC. So for those of you unfamiliar with us, with Rower LLC, we are a New York law firm formed in 2017, dedicated to matrimonial and family law. We have approximately 30 professionals on our team, including about 21 attorneys. Our firm provides litigation and alternate dispute resolution services in really all aspects of matrimonial and family law, including prenuptial agreements, postnuptial agreements, divorce, parent coordination, and fertility law. And we also provide services on the T&E side, the trust and estate side of what we do. So my name is Dilpreet Rai, and I will be moderating this evening. I'm a partner with Rower, and I've been exclusively practicing matrimonial and family law in New York since around 2011. And prior to starting in the world of family and matrimonial law, I was a commercial litigator for about 6 years. And I realized I'd rather help people rather than corporations. So here I am many years later. I'm excited to facilitate this panel and this conversation tonight with 3 amazing and wonderful people who I've had the opportunity to get to know even more in preparation for this evening. So let me introduce them each to you. So first we have Melinda Gould. Melinda is, can you say hi, Melinda? Melinda is an independent divorce consultant specializing in helping clients navigate the challenges of divorce. She coaches clients through the emotional, financial, and even just the logistical aspects of divorce. And she brings with her tonight her experience in helping clients manage communication with all parties involved in divorce. So lawyers, spouses, children, and other professionals. And Melinda draws from her own professional background as well as her own difficult, contentious divorce to support her and her clients. Nicole Hurley. Say hi, Nicole. Nicole is counsel with Rower. Nicole works with individuals and families on their estate planning and has been practicing exclusively in the field for approximately 10 years. She also has experience with supplemental needs planning and long-term care planning. Often those involve difficult conversations. And then we have Siobhan Stewart. Siobhan is a partner in our firm who represents clients in divorce and the negotiation of prenups and postnuptial agreements. And Siobhan transitioned from big law to matrimonial law because she was drawn to the more personal aspects of representation. And frankly, I think Siobhan just likes talking about divorce and death. So that's why she's here today to talk to us about some of those issues. All right, so let's begin. There is a Q&A, some housekeeping. There is a Q&A box where you can put your questions in. We've got a lot to cover, but we will be monitoring the Q&A, and we will try to answer any questions during the session and then also at the end. But certainly if we don't get to your question, you can also reach out to any one of us. You can find our contact details on our website, rowerllc.com, and we'd be happy to pick up the conversation with you. Okay, so first, why are these conversations so challenging? Okay, so I think that these are emotionally charged, and it's important for us to recognize the complexity of these conversations before we even talk about how to engage in them, right? So let's go kind of around, okay? So can you give me one reason why these conversations are particularly difficult to have, conversations around postnups, prenups, divorce, and trust and estates planning? Let's start with Melinda.
I would say money and love, which are always complicated on their own, but more so when they're put together. There's two charged topics that explode together.
Okay, what about Nicole? What do you think?
Probably pick family dynamics. So whether it's with your soon-to-be spouse or extended family, you're dealing, especially in the trust and estates world, with generational issues. And those topics, they're topics that people have very, very strong feelings about, right, between the parties, and then also extended family.
Okay. Siobhan, do you have one for us?
Sure. So all of these issues, prenups, postnups, divorce, estate planning issues, all hit on issues of concern about security, both financial, but also just security in your life, where you are, with whom you have relationships, I should say, and concerns about the future.
Okay, so well, everyone who knows me knows that I love to add my point into a conversation. So I would just also add in that I think, in my experience, these conversations are particularly difficult because often we're dealing with concepts that are just unfamiliar. And there's just a general lack of information or misinformation out there, right? So I think, not knowing what you're talking about or what you should be talking about makes these particularly difficult, and what terms you should be using and what the terms mean, right? Okay, so let's get to some do's and don'ts. Do's and don'ts, okay? So Melinda, I think in preparing for tonight, one of the things that we all felt and saw was that there were certainly like general concepts and practice points to keep in mind regardless of the topic. And so let's get those out front, and then we can delve deeper as we go through each topic. What are some of the do's and don'ts or basic concepts to keep in mind that really apply to any of the topics today? Oh, Melinda, you're muted. I always wanted to say that in a recorded session.
You're welcome. You're welcome for the opportunity. You're welcome. We didn't plan that. I'm going to start with just a few before I even get to the do's and don'ts, 4 points that I think I always emphasize in any of these conversations that are so crucial, which is first, if you feel unsafe or you are a victim of domestic violence of any kind, many of these tips do not apply to you. That said, please reach out to us and we'll help you figure out the right course of action. If you're uncertain, we're here as well. And in fact, Rower has a particular expertise in this area. So I just wanted to get that out of the way and make that perfectly clear. Second, if there are any issues of power dynamics that don't make for an even playing field, a narcissist or a bully, please keep that in mind too when you're hearing our advice. And third, fear and shame are normal, universal feelings, and they should and can be worked through. No one's getting married assuming they're going to get divorced. You're madly in love and you don't want to tell your, potential partner that your parents are insisting on a prenup. These are hard and you're scared to do it, and that's normal. And they can, like all fear and shame, they're made much easier once we face them. And lastly, you'll want to punt. It's a human condition, but with tough conversations, I can say from personal experience that the anticipation is often much worse than the reality of having it. So, taking that first step and being prepared for the conversation, but then having it is always a relief, I would say. So on my top do's and don'ts, first, trust your intuition while you're getting a reality check from trusted friends and professionals. You know your situation, the person you're talking to, better than anybody else. So please trust your intuition, even if other people's voices are louder than your own at the beginning. Secondly, breathe. This is a journey and it's a process. And Rome wasn't built in a day, and none of these things happen immediately either. So take a deep breath and take it one step at a time. And third, and much of the reason why we're here tonight, is educate yourself about the legal issues, the logistics, and of course, any actions that are helpful to take in advance of talking. The more prepared you are before you begin the conversation, the better the conversation will go. And that doesn't mean that there still won't be a lot of, I have no idea, I'll get back to you. But the more you know, the better you'll feel going into the conversation. And that really leads to the fourth point, which is seek all types of expertise you need in addition to legal, psychological advice. Talk to family, talk to friends, not only because there's information you need, but because there is better and worse way to have these conversations. And getting feedback will be essential to achieve that best outcome. My fifth point is please make a specific plan, write it down. Even if you don't read the notes, the process of planning it all out will be extremely helpful to you rather than blurting out things that keep swirling in your head. The when and where are crucial. And remember to always say, it's okay, I don't know. And let me think about it, or I'll get back to you. That again, patience with yourself as well as with the other person is important. And lastly, do respect that this is just the beginning of these conversations. We're going to talk a lot about that, and that you don't need to cover every detail or know the answer to every question. And it's okay for the other person also to need time to process, which we'll get into in greater detail in each of the specific situations. Quickly on the don't have these conversations after a long day for either party. Best to wait for a quiet, more rested time. Please don't assume the other person is on the same page or will simply understand. You're likely to have had a lot of time thinking about these issues. I can say in my own personal story that, I was so sure of what I was the one who initiated the divorce. And even though we had talked about the troubles in the marriage, my husband was still utterly and completely shocked. And I have to respect that that was the first time he was taking that in. So, it may be a brand new topic for the listener. And fourth, don't negotiate on the fly. Third, don't negotiate on the fly. The lawyers in the room here are going to tell you, please don't do that, because then you have to undo it and you lose credibility. And you also may put yourself in a situation where you've agreed to things you don't want to do. In that same vein, don't demand immediate response from the other person. I know I'm being a little redundant about it, but it's so important. You've had time to think about this and they haven't. And lastly, I just want to leave you with, do not panic. It is a process. It has unfolded and resolved millions of times before for lots of other people, and it will for you as well. It just might not look like it's going to unfold in the way or the timetable as you anticipated, but there is a way, and we're here to help you figure that out. Thank you, Dilly.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, is that it's a process. And I think that, one of the themes here is that it's not just one conversation. Oftentimes there's going to be multiple conversations, and it is a process, and not to expect results and finality in one conversation that's going to resolve it all, right?
And Dilly, I would just add too that these conversations aren't going to be linear. You're going to feel like you've made great progress, and then they're going to come back, and then you're going to go off in another way. And again, it's all normal, albeit frustrating, but it does still, you will get to the end of the road. But it's twisty and turny journey.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's kind of get into the details of each topic. So the first one we want to talk about is prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, and we're going to take them, in turn. But so for people getting married, or some who are already married, a prenup and a postnup, these are marital agreements, and they may play a role in their relationship. So since most of our group is not matrimonial or not matrimonial lawyers, Siobhan, can you share, like, at a high level, what are generally the goals of a marital agreement, so that we can all get on the same page first?
Sure. So the goal of a marital agreement is to allow a couple to make their own decisions about key financial aspects of their marriage. And while it often doesn't feel like such a romantic idea, this can be discussed very respectfully. The process can be had respectfully. That's what we're here to talk about today. And it really is an excellent opportunity for couples to chart their own financial course and to come up with their own rules for how their finances will work during their marriage, rather than to simply accept the default rules under state law that would apply to them in the absence of one of these agreements. So that's the goal.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I know as a commercial litigator, I had no idea what they were until I started matrimonial practice. So our audience is already one step ahead there. All right, so let's break this down into the two types of agreements, because the conversation and the challenges around the conversation, including like the when and the why, may be different around both. So what are some of the more difficult points about discussing a prenuptial agreement?
Sure. So I'll actually just step back for a second and say that whether you're talking about a prenup or a postnup, these conversations are going to be awkward. And there's kind of no getting around that, because talking about money is awkward. And particularly in the case of a prenup, you're going to be talking about, or your lawyer is going to be talking about, issues that I think a lot of us learn are verboten, things that you cannot ask people. You're going to be asking those questions. So the following is going to come up. What kind of assets do you have? How much money do you make? What do your parents have? What's the likelihood you're going to end up getting some of that? So while these conversations are going to be inevitably awkward, the excellent news is that they're really useful. And these conversations are useful for people whether or not you're going to get a prenup, because so much, and anybody in the virtual room who's married knows this, but so much of marriage is about money. And so couples who start talking about these issues before they get married have a leg up, because they start getting practice talking with each other about these difficult issues. And a couple who has talked before they got married about what's going to happen in the event we get a divorce, what are we going to do with our home? If we have to sell it, how are we going to share the proceeds? Those people are going to have a much easier time talking about how to put a down payment on an apartment when it comes time to think about buying a home together. So these conversations are difficult, but they are worthwhile. And there are some concrete steps that couples can take to make these conversations more effective, to soften them around the edges a little bit, and also to make them just feel personal to who the couple is, to make sure that the agreement ultimately reflects really who you are. And some of those steps are things that Melinda mentioned. First, obviously, educate yourself. Talk to a lawyer about the issues that are going to come up in the prenup process, so that you know what they are and so that you can start thinking about them. And then absolutely write down talking points. And when you're doing this, I think it's really important to make these talking points really very personal, and to reflect who you are and what you're, be a little vulnerable. Write down talking points that reflect what's a real concern for you. And I also think that it's really helpful to share those talking points with your lawyer, because although your lawyer's job is, to negotiate terms and to make sure that the language is right, your lawyer is also going to be an advocate for what it is that's important to you personally. And so to the extent you can educate your lawyer about those issues, it's really helpful. And you asked about what are some of the difficult issues to talk about in the prenup process. That idea of writing down the issues that are important to you, I think, can be so helpful in talking about some of the thornier issues. One really difficult issue for many of my clients is talking about spousal support. It can be a really touchy issue. There's a lot wrapped up. It's emotionally charged. Like Melinda said, issues of love and money, and self-worth. When you're talking about those issues, it can be very difficult. And another issue that is really difficult for some couples to talk about in the prenup process is, how do you share assets when the two spouses receive their income or earn their income in really different ways that are treated differently under the law? That can be a really difficult thing to dig into. And I will share a story here. I had a recent prenup client who faced this issue, and she really dug into what her concerns were on this issue, and it completely changed the process of negotiation, and it really resulted in an excellent outcome for her. So in this case, she worked at a tech company. She earns a solid income, and her husband-to-be is independently wealthy and receives most of his income from trust distributions. So those two sources of income are going to be treated differently under the law in New York. And we had to think about, well, how are the assets and income that both of them are going to receive during the marriage going to be treated on a divorce? And we got his proposal, and she hated it. And she hated it because she realized, after sitting down with pen and paper and writing down her feelings, she realized what she hated about it was that he proposed to put into the marital pot some of his trust distributions over a super long period of time. And it didn't reflect the fact that they had been together for 15 years. And so she explained that to him. I explained it to his lawyer, and she expressed herself so compellingly in this process that it ended up resulting in a totally different structure, where essentially the assets were shared as if they were in a long-term marriage on day one.
Thank you. The examples are always super helpful, and to see how it plays out, how the practice point plays out in reality. So thank you for that. And so I guess the question here is, when you're sitting down to write out your talking points, what if you have no idea what goes into a prenup or a postnup? So when does speaking with an attorney fit into the timing with respect to speaking with your spouse about a prenuptial agreement?
So absolutely beforehand, if that's something you can do, both because it gives you an idea of what you're going to be talking about, and also because, as Melinda mentioned, although what you say when you talk to your spouse, your future spouse, you might be able to backtrack on that. Well, I should say actually that you can, but it makes for a rockier process. And so it's always best in these conversations to speak to a lawyer first, to think about, to understand what the issues are that you're going to be dealing with, think about what it is that you want from those issues, and then to talk to your future spouse. So you don't end up, sort of rooting yourself in positions that you later want to change.
Okay. Okay, so let's switch gears to postnuptial agreements. And let's, again, take this topic in two parts. So first, what are some of the common issues? And if you get the question, I'll remind you. Okay, so don't worry. But what are some common issues or concerns that lead couples to seek a postnuptial agreement? And second, what are some of the unique challenges in tackling the conversations because of these different circumstances that may lead to the discussion?
So just at the outset, I will say again, since we're not all matrimonial lawyers, and I know actually some people just don't know what a postnup is. It's the same idea as a prenup. It is an agreement that allows couples to make their own rules about financial matters related to their marriage. But it is something that is developed during the marriage. So once people are already married. And for that reason, these conversations can be far more emotionally charged. And, they come up, in my experience, discussion of postnups comes up when one spouse, one or both, is feeling really insecure and has fears about what would happen on a divorce, particularly with respect to financial outcome. And those issues can come up for any number of reasons. Often it's because of an infidelity that makes people start thinking in real terms about, well, what if we do end up getting divorced? And if that happens, where am I going to live? What is my asset profile going to be? Am I going to have spousal support? Am I going to be paying spousal support? This issue also comes up sometimes when when one of the spouses has stepped back from the workforce. And I actually see this issue coming up a lot where one spouse feels that they have made an outsized contribution to the marriage, and they want to make sure that in the event of a divorce, that contribution is recognized. So in terms of how these conversations are different, of course they're similar because you want to talk to a lawyer at the outset for a little bit of a different reason. You want to make sure that the outcome that you're looking for is actually something that's feasible and something that can reasonably be done. And you want to have that understanding before you speak with your spouse. And then I would say that, of course, you want to write out talking points and you want to think about how you're going to deliver this. But I would say that a nuance here is that it's even more important in this context to really think through some of the questions that you expect your spouse to ask and spend the time to think about what your answers to those questions are. And the reason I think that's so important with respect to postnups is even if the reason that you're thinking about a postnup is that the other person has done something disrespectful to you, if you want this process to be as smooth and effective as possible, it's important to respect where the other person is in this conversation. So that's why I suggest really thinking about the issues that are going to be of concern to them and trying to come up with some answers to those questions before you have the conversation.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now I've listened to you, Siobhan. I've made my list. I've talked to professionals. I'm ready, right? I'm ready to have the conversation. But what if the recipient, the other side of this, says, I'm not ready to talk about it? So what are some tips if you were the one on the receiving end of a partner asking for one of these agreements?
So that actually happens a lot. And I think there are a few things that you can do that are important there. First of all, as Melinda said, respect the fact that they haven't had the time that you've had to think about this, and give them the space to educate themselves and to think about their positions on the issues. And there are so many reasons to do that. One, because you want to respect your future or current spouse, but also because if you both are informed and educated on these issues, the discussion you have is just going to be better and it's going to be smoother. In the case of either a prenup or a postnup, if your spouse or future spouse doesn't want to engage, another thing that you can do after you've given them some space to think about this issue is to suggest that they talk to a lawyer. And obviously that's something that's probably going to occur to them without your saying it. But if you say it, that might be sort of the nudge that they need to actually take that step.
Okay.
And just one other thing I want to add. You have to know that you may need to have this conversation many times. So if during the first conversation, the other person is not receptive, just expect that this is something that's natural and that this is something that you may have to raise a few times in order to get traction on this issue.
Okay. And we do have a question in the Q&A, which is just, what is the profile of an engaged couple that does not need a prenup? That's a really big question. And I think, I'll just offer in that I think the point here is that you need to talk to a professional. And so whether you are the one contemplating, do I need this or do I not need it? Or someone approaches you and says, hey, I think we need this. The only way to really know whether you fit the profile of maybe someone who does not need it, and I think there are just a very few categories of people who probably don't need it. I think you need to educate yourself and speak with someone before you can figure out whether you fit that profile or a couple fits it. I don't think I don't think I could answer that in a single session, but I just wanted to put that out there and recognize that I am monitoring the Q&A as we go here.
And I'll just add to that one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about the goal of a prenup is one reason that some people enter into prenups is to make sure that they're cementing the default rules so that they apply to them in the future, because some of those default rules may change in the future. They may change 10 or 15 years from now. And so if in the future you're getting a divorce, there may be a different set of default rules. And, there are people who may wish that they had entered into a prenup or a postnup so they could cement those for themselves. But I do, of course, agree that anybody who is thinking about this issue should talk to a lawyer about their specific profile.
All right, so I think we've all heard the term that, or the phrase that when you get married, you're not just marrying your spouse, but you're marrying the family. And I think that oftentimes, in my experience, you need family involvement, and sometimes you want to stay clear of family involvement in the prenup process. So what are some specific ways that family influence shows up in a prenup discussion, and how does that affect the conversation, or what can we keep in mind in terms of figuring out how best to structure and have those conversations when there are family dynamics and issues at play?
So I will say that I see this a lot in my work, and the two reasons that I see, well, three reasons that I see family involvement happening most often is where parents ask a child to get a prenup to make sure that the family assets are available for the family as opposed to future spouses and future ex-spouses. I see this come up where one spouse has family members in their extended family who may need ongoing care, and so it makes them concerned about the idea of either agreeing to pay spousal support in the future or to share their assets on death. And so it may be that a spouse has elderly parents who need help, or I often see people who are talking about a prenup with their spouse have real concerns about a sibling who has special needs that they expect that they're going to want to care for a very long time. And then finally, of course, this comes up where one of the spouses has children from another marriage that they either need to support because they're young or want to support because they're no longer young but can use the help. And there I'd say, one thing that I've seen over the years is that when these issues come up, it's typically not simply because the family is concerned about it, but also because the spouse is concerned about these issues. And I say that just to note that when these issues come up, they are very likely going to end up being reflected in the prenup. And so I think the key there, though, is for the person whose family is going to be involved or whose family issues are going to be involved to really show their spouse some support and make sure that they are taking on the responsibility of digging into the reasons that the family is going to be involved, understanding those reasons, and talking directly with their future spouse about these issues. So for example, if it's that a parent or extended family is requiring a prenup of someone, that they speak with their parents, speak with their family members, understand the reasons, and then have a conversation with your spouse to be and explain to them what the concern is. And, while this outcome sometimes may just be inevitable, I think it goes a long way to explain this to the spouse who's not related to the family members so that they understand that there is a real reason here for the concern, and also so that they feel that they've had an opportunity to be heard and to have a discussion about it.
Okay. So, it seems to me, one of the key themes that I've seen in conversations about when the conversations go well or how the process unfolds from the initial conversation around a prenup is around the issue of timing. And it can often affect sort of the tone and the effectiveness of the subsequent conversations when that timing. So what's the magic when your soon-to-be spouse, if you need a prenup, when should you have the conversation with your betrothed or your not betrothed?
You're almost betrothed.
Yeah.
It should be, well, that's actually the key to the magic answer. So the answer is as soon as possible. I mean, I have had clients who have had these conversations from basically the time they've started dating people. And while that may sound a little early, I think you can't do it too early. And if there is a magic when, it is absolutely before the engagement. And in my practice, I think I don't see enough people doing that. And I think it really is, it's the respectful route to take to have that conversation before you get engaged.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a recent experience where they got engaged, they announced it to all their family and friends. And after that's out in the open, then it was like, well, we need a prenup. And it'll be fine. We'll get through it. But I think it just sets a certain tone, and the person's feeling like, well, I just told everyone this is out in the open, and now I'm not sure I want this. So I think if the conversation was had before, it might have added some sort of confidence and comfort to the other person who's willing to engage in it. But
right. And I agree. And of course, if this is a couple who's going to get married, they're going to have difficult conversations, right? So this too shall pass. They will get over it, likely, if the prenup isn't brought up until after the engagement. But if you craft these conversations in a way that is most likely to feel comfortable for the other person, that's going to be reflected throughout the entirety of the process, and the entire process is going to be smoother and more comfortable.
Okay, so last question, because we're kind of running short in time and I want to get to all the very exciting things around death and divorce. But just real quick, because we talked about family dynamics in prenups, if you are a parent, I'm not sure what age range or who we're talking to, but if you're a parent and it's going to be important to you that your child has a prenup, there are certain issues, family businesses, trusts, or whatever the range might be. When should you have that conversation with your child?
So here the answer is even earlier, and as early as possible. And, I think a lot of people probably think, well, there's no need to talk about it until my child is dating someone very seriously. And I think that they're going to probably end up marrying this person. If you can do it beforehand, that's extremely helpful for many reasons, including that way, your child and their future spouse aren't going to have any reason to think that this is being brought up because of the particular person that they're dating. So if you can do it earlier, you avoid that concern.
Okay. So let's move on. And if there are any questions on prenups, postnups, just put them in the Q&A. We can try to come back to them at the end. With trust and estates planning, let's turn to Nicole. Nicole, can you share some basics with us? What is meant by trust and estates? What's a T&E attorney? What are you helping families navigate? A lot of questions, but really, one question overall.
Got it. So with a comprehensive estate plan, right? And we want to talk about a comprehensive estate plan. We're really trying to help navigate two distinct areas, incapacity and then death. And those really involve two sets of documents. You have your advance directives, which at a very general level are providing instructions and putting people in charge during the potential period where you are incapacitated, but still alive. And then also on a very general level, you have your wills and your trusts, which with some exceptions are designed to do things after you've passed away, right? You appoint the people you want to be in charge, your executors, potentially your trustees, your guardians who's taking care of your kids, and then you are naming who your beneficiaries are, who you want to receive your stuff.
Okay. So what are the common areas of conflict that you see within your work with T&E planning that are going to require some amount of hard and possibly uncomfortable communications with others in your family?
So one of the biggest challenges that arrives when we're talking about trust and estates planning is just the lack of communication amongst families, right? Melinda said up front, avoidance causes some of the worst family problems. So there are many different areas that could potentially cause conflict, right? And it'll be different for each situation. But just in general, some of the big ones are when we're talking about distribution of assets, right? So who's going to receive your property? And it's mainly if you're doing an unequal distribution, right? The default in a lot of situations is you have two kids, they're getting 50-50, but what if that's not the case? One's getting more. You want to make sure you're talking about it. And in addition to that, what if you're leaving the assets to them in a different way? One's getting it outright into their individual name, they do with it what they want, and the other's being held in trust for their benefit, right? With someone else potentially managing it. Another big point of contention where a lot of people just don't think about is with personal property, right? Your stuff, your clothing, your jewelry, art, furniture. It's really where the sentimental value is attached, right? And it doesn't matter that it's worth nothing. It's where the memories are. And so it's important to think about where you want your personal property to go, right? Melinda told the story during our practices that in her parents' will, they just said, we're going to give it to you. You decide what to do, right? That's probably not the ideal situation. So talking about it with your family, right? Are there items that they want? And that way you're just outlining it in the document to avoid conflict later on. There's also can be a lot of conflict, and there should be a lot of discussions regarding potentially supplemental needs beneficiaries. And so a big one, who's that beneficiary going to live with? Who's in charge of taking care of them? Who's going to manage the money for them? So that's something that needs to be addressed as early as possible. And then second marriages, right? We're talking about prenups, postnups, and divorces, and then children from prior marriages. It often involves documents that were put in place either before the couple got married or during the marriage, and you have to include those in your documents. So that, of course, is something that's awkward and uncomfortable, but needs to be addressed. And then lastly, decisions regarding end of life choices, burial and funeral. They are charged with emotion, and they often are coming up during a time that is awful for people. So just making sure that those topics are being discussed often and early as well.
Okay. And so there's just a lot. That's a lot.
There's a lot.
Just went through a lot. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed over here. So, from your experience, what are some key points and tips to take away about the best way to communicate within families around these issues? So if you're sitting on the sofa next to your brother and your sister this holiday season, and you really want, mom's green emerald ring. Not trying to make light of it, but the point is that we are going to have opportunities maybe or in the holidays to have these conversations. So what are some key things to help make these conversations go a little smoother, rougher around the edges, less rough around, smooth around the edges?
So it may sound simple, but it's really just to start. Right? The hardest part is the initial conversation about death and incapacity, right? They're not pleasant. No one wants to talk about them except for me, right? Because I do it on a day-to-day basis, right? But no one else wants to. And so, but by initiating the conversation, you are going to make a period of time that is awful, right? For your family easier, because they will know that they are following what you wanted and they will know what you want. So it's really just starting, and it's the theme throughout, but it's an initial conversation. We need to continue having it, but again, just start. And then if you are the child, for example, and your parent doesn't want to talk about it, I wouldn't be ashamed to bring it up, right? It can come from a position of caring, right? So for example, my parents, I'm a T&E attorney, have no planning documents or had no planning documents in place whatsoever. And I truly believe that my mother thinks that as soon as she starts talking about death and incapacity, that she's either going to become incapacitated or pass away, like immediately. And so I've had to start bringing it up. My sister has jumped in too. And we don't do it all at once. We do it in pieces, and we try to keep it as lighthearted as possible. But it helps, right? And just recently, my grandmother's partner was in the hospital and ended up being placed in a coma. And so I think because we had talked to my mom about it, she was then able to talk to her mother about it in the hospital, and now has a very clear understanding of what she would want in these situations. And so I think, again, just start. It'll get easier the more that you talk about it. And it really doesn't have to be all doom, right? It can be. I think of these decisions as empowering, right? You are giving yourself the opportunity to make your end of life and after your death what you want it to be. And you are, I guess, giving your children the ability to know that they are doing what you wanted. So that's just, I guess, number one, just start. And then talk often, talk early. Your documents only get you so far, right? You need to put these documents in place, right? That is a crucial step. But they can only outline so much. So just going through different scenarios, right? Using the example in the hospital, right? If they thought that you would recover, do you want life-sustaining treatment at that point, right? If there's a chance, right? So just going through what the different subcategories or different topics are can help beyond just putting the documents in place. And then say the same thing to everyone, please, right? If you have 3 children, don't promise each of them the emerald ring.
It's fine.
If you're going to give it to one, tell them, and then tell the others the same thing. You don't ever want to create conflict among, at least I don't think that you want to create conflict amongst people later on. So it's just keep an open door with all beneficiaries and all people involved to the extent possible.
So, you've made it really clear. My takeaway is have these conversations, have them often. Don't be scared of them. But if there is a particular when to make them more effective, and in the way we approach them, when is that?
So everyone's at it, right? Yeah. As early as possible, right? And definitely when we're talking about trust and estates planning, when you're healthy, right? You don't want to be scrambling because you just got a diagnosis and now you're trying to throw these documents together, right? Doesn't give you time to talk about your decisions with your other family members. It's just rushed. And I actually, even for young kids, would do it. And young, I mean adults, right? As soon as you turn 18 or your kids turn 18, maybe consider putting advanced directives in place, right? As uncomfortable as that conversation may be, you are no longer their legal guardian. You no longer have the right to know any of their health records, to know anything about their bank accounts. So by putting those advanced directives in place, for example, your healthcare proxies, powers of attorney, you're putting yourself in a position where you can help if they need it. Also, when you get divorced, right? I do not think that you want your soon-to-be ex-spouse having the power to pull the plug, right? So just updating those. And when you get married, I think Siobhan talked about it, but there are default rules in place for what's to happen with your property and decision-making power for when you do get married. And that may be what you want, but it may not be. So just, learning about it and deciding, what you want. And then there's this misconception about waiting until you're wealthy enough, right? And that estate planning is only for the wealthy, and that is just not true, right? Making sure that your assets go to the beneficiaries is important no matter what those assets are worth, right? And especially when we're talking about those advanced directives, you want to make sure that when you're incapacitated, that your instructions are laid out and that the people that you want are in place.
Okay, so we have we have a shout out from Nicole's mom on the Q&A, but then we also have which is fabulous. Hi, Nicole's mom. We also have a question about having conversations with the children and not saying different things. But is it okay not to share with the children what the will specifically says? Because it may get less during the course of someone's life. And then when the money's not there because child number 2 needed more money during the parent's lifetime than child number 1, could that cause conflict?
So there is no legal requirement that you share, right? And I do not think that in all situations that you have to. I think it really depends on the family dynamics, right? And I guess there is, if it was equal and now it's changed, that's a hard conversation to have, but maybe it's an important one to have, right? What's happening that makes that happen? And I always say at a minimum, if you're not comfortable doing it and talking about it while you're alive, maybe put a letter in place that explains what your thoughts were to keep with your will, right? It's not legally binding. It's not going to really have any effect. But if you can just even address your reasons then, it makes the beneficiary not have to question it as much, right? Because ultimately, who's going to have conflict is the siblings later on, right? If there's some animosity about how the will was done. So just any way that you can address that, I think is ideal.
Can I just jump in and say the thing that blows my mind is like, everyone does die. Like it's not like, oh, I don't need to do that. And there's a part, I think, in society that we don't talk about that very often. And that the gift that you give to your children or your friends when you're in the hospital or even planning a funeral. I mean, my mother told me what tablecloth to use at her funeral. I mean, and it sounds silly, but it actually was like when I was doing it, I'm like, oh, just what mom wanted, And that ability to talk about it. I love what you said, Nicole, when people are healthy, and it's a gift to your children to have those conversations, and you can normalize it for them. And it's a big responsibility, but it's also, I think, an extraordinary opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just want to, I think, add in here that, it's so important to have these conversations when you're healthy. But we're talking a lot about, a parent passing away and sort of this upward, this discussion. But I think it's important, that, I often hear, I've heard where, you're newly married, you're young, and you haven't had a conversation with your spouse about these directives, or what happens if you're incapacitated and you need a guardian appointed for you. Should your new spouse be the person that's in charge of your person? Should your new spouse be in charge of your finances? And so I think that these are really difficult conversations, but important to have no matter what age you are and your life circumstances in that one particular time. So I think if there's a takeaway from this is that gloom and doom, not the best conversation for, over the turkey, but it's okay to have these conversations and to normalize them with your family members. And that will make it easier as the time goes on. And if your parents won't listen to you, make an appointment with a T&E attorney and bring everyone in. And then they can be educated, and most likely they'll turn around and say, why didn't we do this before? Once they hear all the different things. All right, so on to the much happier topic of divorce. So there is a lot we could cover here. And we spent probably more time talking to each other than we have to talk with you guys this evening, just about all of this. But what are some of the first issues, Siobhan, that people need to deal with and discuss after deciding to get divorced?
So I'll just start with saying that the first conversation, of course, is to tell your spouse that you want to get a divorce. And here I'm so surprised. I have been surprised to see how many clients tell me that they have told their spouse that they want a divorce, and their spouse's reaction is to say no. And so the takeaway there is to be prepared that you may have to have that particular conversation many times. And that first conversation can simply involve your spouse saying, no, I don't want to get a divorce. This conversation is over. Or it can actually lead to follow-up questions and a real conversation. And I think it's important to be ready for both of those outcomes. And to not be terribly surprised if you just get cut off, you're going to have to raise that again. And once that initial conversation happens, typically there are a few issues that come up that have to be discussed at the outset. And some of those conversations include, if you have children, how are you going to have that conversation with the children, and are you going to do it together? The answer is yes, if you can. And then after that conversation, often there's a follow-up conversation about, well, how and when are we going to start living apart? And when we do that, how are the bills going to be paid? And the other conversation that I'd say comes up most often early on in the process is, what is the process that we're going to use? How do we get a divorce? And that conversation is around, do we do mediation? Do we do a collaborative law process? Are we going to litigate this divorce? And so there can be many conversations about that issue as well.
Okay, and that is one of the biggest questions I get is, how do we tell our children? When do we tell them? So we're going to put a pin in it. We're going to come back to that question. But first, Melinda, so why don't, now that we've identified some of the conversations that people are going to have around divorce, can you give us some general ideas or tips that people should consider as they begin this journey of communicating around it?
Yes, absolutely. What I've seen time and time again is that people do two things. wrong. They either blurt out the desire in a heated moment that they want the divorce, or they avoid it at all costs to quote unquote find the perfect moment. And those are textbook, and we're really here to help you, avoid both of them. And all of these scenarios apply in all communication in divorce. So first, how to tell your partner. Let me start by saying, don't assume your partner won't be shocked, even if you've used the D word many times. Sort of, why now? Is I hear a lot from people who are still surprised, or they're sure their partner won't be surprised, their spouse won't be surprised, and then they're equally shocked that they were. And the answer to how and when is really depends on. But it's important to know that there is no one right answer, and that no one knows your partner better than you do. So you should, again, trust yourself around the timing and seek advice. For some, advance notice is important, like, I want to talk to you tomorrow about where things are between us. Can we set up a time to talk? And for other people, 2 minutes notice is the best, because they won't, once you say you want to talk, they're going to want to talk in that moment anyway. The literal where to do it is, again, very personal. I happen to tell my husband in couples therapy because I wanted the support of the therapist. For some people, you certainly want a neutral place. Is it outside? Is it inside? That's really up to you. But the one thing I will say is universal. I prefer when people don't do it when the kids are in the house, and that you have time and are not going to be interrupted. And the most important part is to actually just do it if that's what you want. It's never the perfect time. School is starting. There's a new job. Holidays are coming. It's very easy and desirable to delay it until you hit your limit, and you want to make sure that you do it in a calm way rather than when you just can't take it anymore. Some basics about when not to do it. And some of these things are redundant, but I think they warrant a little repetition. Don't do it when anybody's exhausted. You're trying to set this up for success, right? So these are common sense answers. Don't do it when you might be interrupted, or when someone's off to a meeting or running to a business trip. And certainly don't do it before another event, as you're driving to a dinner party, or, given our topic today, while you're on your way to grandma's for Christmas Eve. That is just not the right moment, no matter how much you can't take it, or you don't want to be going to the dinner, so you just blurt it out. That's where the planning comes in. So, finding that moment and really planning it out. And it's, there are a few more anxiety producing things you have to do, but, there's a way to be most prepared.
Okay, so I promised the audience when and how to tell your children.
I think for many people, including me, it was harder to tell my kids than to tell my spouse. So I think the answer to that, and I'm not trying to pun, is it really depends on the age of your kids and what's appropriate and what they can take in and how much information they have. So it varies greatly. And, my first piece of advice is always to get professional help, whether your kids have a therapist or whether you need to speak to another child psychologist. Really get advice. There's a lot of great information on the internet. All of the lawyers on this call, I can give you advice. They can give you advice. You want to talk to people who have heard stories before about what well and what didn't. And I think, to back that up a little bit, it's really a joint conversation with your spouse. So together to make a plan, to acknowledge the need for the professional advice and the importance of putting the kids first in a unified front, even if you are not feeling unified about anything else. And also, most importantly, not to say anything, disparaging about the other person. Like, I have to get divorced. Your dad's a pain in the ass. Like, don't say that. Try to keep it really, as neutral as possible. And that's really hard, especially when one person really, really doesn't want the divorce. But that is the goal. And I would add, it's really best to wait until you have a semblance of a plan of some form to move forward, because you are, no matter what age, you're going to get some questions like, where are we going to live? And what's about Christmas? And so if you can answer some of the questions and be confident in those answers and be on the same page, that's helpful. And lastly, I think I would add, which I've seen go poorly many times, is stick to the plan. Stick to the script of what you say you're going to say, and don't waver, because, again, like everything we're saying here, it's going to be the first of many, many, many conversations you're going to have with your kids, and how you think they're going to respond I can almost tell you is not how they're going to respond. I shared, with my panelists earlier today, that when I told my daughter, who was 12, her reaction, never, I couldn't have called it in a billion years, was, so that she was 12. That means that my children will have divorced grandparents. And I was like, what? We're worrying about something 20 years from now. But, and really one other really important point on the kids thing is kids are inherently self-centered. Like, that's just how they are designed. How does it affect me? What does it mean to me? Well, I have, my stuffed animal at both homes. So you're thinking about money and you're thinking about all sorts of other, they're not. They're thinking about themselves. So if you keep your eye on their lens, you're going to be in a much better shape and worry a lot less.
Yeah. And one of the times where I saw this work best with a couple is when they actually wrote out a script. Wow. With their child's therapist. And they reviewed it and they emailed it and they had it all worked out. And it was, really best case scenario, but they all felt comfortable about what was going to be conveyed in that moment, because this is, again, there may be multiple conversations with your child and your children. So what was the goal of that conversation and how it was going to be said? And they even sort of signed parts to each of them. Right. And so they all went in and they stuck to the script. And I think that allowed them to reduce their own anxiety around the topic and to hopefully make it a more positive experience, for their child. And I think, a key point that we've talked a lot about is setting the goal for that particular conversation. And, not trying to cover everything at one time seems to be an effective technique to get through that conversation. So just want to throw that out there. What about, we live in the age of technology. And so we're talking about a lot of these conversations about, face-to-face interaction and what are your thoughts, Melinda, on that? On how to handle conversations?
Don't do it by text. How about we'll start with that? Here's tip number one. Don't use text. And we were talking earlier that, texting is, I would say avoid as much texting as possible. With my clients, I'm like, use email. It just slows everything down. And it's good to slow it down, to put a pause into all of your actions. For some people, as we said, you're going to know your situation. You're going to talk to your lawyer. You're going to have therapists. You're going to have other people advising you. Where we started the whole conversation, you want to make sure you feel safe. For some, it's been on Zoom because it's with a therapist and the sessions are on Zoom. I certainly think in person is ideal if you can do it. You've been married, you've been through a lot, and it warrants that, but you're going to have to trust your instinct, except I'd say avoid texting.
Fair point. Okay, so let me just see what else, if there's other stuff that we really want to cover here. And I'm going to ask the panelists if there's anything that any burning point that you want to make. Now is a good time to make it. But otherwise, we're going to go to my favorite portion of the evening, which is the rapid fire She Did It Best session. But I want to make sure that we've covered everything that, that anyone wants to raise right now. And then we have a couple of additional questions. Well, how about this, Melinda? Preview or no preview? To your partner that you want to have the conversation.
Wow, I know someone who, laid it out, and they said, they'd been in couples therapy for a long time and the divorce word had been used. And they said, I want to talk to you about it. Let's make a plan. I've come to a conclusion. And the husband, just kept canceling. Or, and it was incredibly frustrating. And it took, it actually ended up taking a few more weeks, which built up a lot of hostility and aggravation. And I think she just called it wrong. I think she should have just had the conversation, given they had used the word before. And, they ended up having it. But the opportunity for additional, the word that I was going to come to was rage. The additional anger that comes, then really slows down the whole process.
So there's one question here. I've heard that sometimes not telling a spouse that you are filing is best for financial reasons. so that accounts can't be frozen before they find out. So the question is really, is there any truth to that? But I'm going to broaden the question to say, what we started off with at the top, which is, no one size fits all. And, not everyone needs the conversation before necessarily. So Siobhan, do you want to speak to that issue a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I'll just echo what you said, that there could be some truth to that for some people. And so you should absolutely, with all of these conversations, you should speak with a lawyer before you have the conversation with your spouse, both so that you know what the issues are that you're going to have to decide, and so that you can get advice that's tailored to your personal situation. Because, if you do have those kinds of concerns about someone transferring funds or hiding assets, that's something that you need to talk to a lawyer about to figure out how to best try to prevent that, or at least put safeguards in place so that you can address those issues, in the context of the divorce.
And I think, Melinda said it initially, but I think it is so important that it should be repeated, that if there are issues of domestic violence, of concerns around that, then, that might be another situation where a preview or a conversation between the two parties may not be the right approach. And so this is really very specific to your needs. But assuming you're capable of having generally, calm, rational conversations with your partner, these are some tips to navigate those types of conversations. Yeah.
And I want to say that a lot of this is out of our control. I have a very close friend whose husband is the one who initiated the divorce, and he had emptied out the safe of all their documents before he told her. Ultimately, she had attorneys and everything got resolved. I say that not to scare, but just to say you can't prepare everything, and things will come up, and and there are professionals and there are laws that will protect you, and you'll get through it. So, we plan, and that's what we can do.
Okay, so I think that, we talked about this a little early on, that sometimes the best way to talk about good strategies is through examples. So I'm just going to kind of rapid fire to our panelists here. Siobhan, can you tell me about a best or worst approach to a conversation that we can all kind of learn from on any of the topics we've talked about today?
Sure. So I'll share a worst case scenario. One of the most horrendous early conversations I've seen in one of my cases is had to do with, telling the children about the divorce. My client was the husband. He wanted a divorce. His wife did not want a divorce. They had some conversations. They figured out a script that they were going to use to tell the children about the divorce, and they sat in the living room, and as he started to deliver the script, she scooped the children into her arms, put them onto her lap, and held on to them for dear life and wept as he spoke, sobbed throughout the entire, the entire discussion. And not only was that terrible for the children, but it set the tone for a bitter and extremely long divorce. There was squabbling about every single aspect of the divorce after that day. He never forgave her, much as I tried to try to soften the edges. He could not get over that. And in the end, that divorce cost them a combined over $2 million in counsel fees. And they, to this day, do not speak to each other. And I really do think that conversation at the outset really set the tone for the rest of the divorce.
Okay.
Oh, I feel like I want to say something good.
Yes. Well,
I have something good.
Yeah. Great.
You
Nicole,
go,
take
Nicole.
it away. Go for it.
So I once had a client who wanted to participate in medical aid in dying in Switzerland. And as you can imagine, that is a very, very emotionally charged and controversial subject, right? But she was adamant, and she talked with her kids, and for a long time prior to really starting the process was open from as soon as she decided that this was something that she wanted to do. They went to therapy together. She just talked, answered any of their questions. And again, this was a long process and multiple conversations, but it resolved itself to the point where the kids supported her enough in this decision to go with her, right? They all went together and they were there for her to the end. And I think that if that situation can be handled well and you can get to that point, then I really think that you can talk through pretty much everything, right? And handle pretty much every difficult conversation. So it's not pleasant, right? But it is my best.
That's great. Melinda.
Mine's actually in the T&E space, and it's about my own journey, which is, my parents passed away a year apart from each other, and that created, and there are 4 siblings, and it was a lot to handle at once. But I want to give a shout out, to my parents, who my father literally, he was ill, but he was still fully capable. And he sat all 4 of us down together and he told us what was in the will. And it wasn't about dollar amounts, reflecting back on another question. It's just, is it even? How will it happen? What's the timing? And then it was uncomfortable. Like, it was not comfortable. Melinda's the executor when she's the youngest, and what the heck? But like, at least it's coming from him, not from me. And that was a gift I actually got from a wealth manager when my dad was sick, to say, he has to tell you all, because otherwise it's going to come out between you. And in that same vein, in terms of the end of life directives, when my dad was passing, my father-in-law was also sick, and he would not sign a DNR. And he was, in his mid-80s, and I saw the hell that it wreaked on his family, and the drama, and it was heartbreaking, and my father wanted to have it tattooed across his chest, DNR, he didn't want any questions asked. And I think that those are really, all of these things are gifts to your children, as in divorce too. The least contentious you can be, if you can keep them top of mind. And I always say that's the truth. That's your legacy. You're not going to be here. And, ultimately on the T&E side, and even in the divorce side, how well they're doing. The kids are looking to the parents. How are they doing? Should I be worried? Is it a disaster? It's kind of like when a 5-year-old, or 3-year-old falls, and like, should I cry? It's quite similar in that way. So I think having open communication and sharing information, I'm talking about on the T&E side, is such a gift. And I feel, when people don't do it, it's such a missed opportunity.
So I'm going to share one of mine, if that's all right. So I think that one of the things we talked about early on was educating yourself. And I think one of the tips that I would throw out there based on this experience is, don't use words you don't know the meaning of in your conversations with your partner. So, I had a situation where they had this conversation, and the wife said, I'm going to have sole custody. And the husband, came in just completely startled. And then as we got into the discussion with the lawyers, we understood that she didn't understand what that meant, the word even custody, right? What that meant, right? There's legal custody, there's residential custody. What does sole custody mean? But it was such a highly charged word that was immediately infused into this conversation with them, that it sort of broke down everything, because, people have notions about what does it mean to have custody of your child, and to be told, no, you're not, I'm going to have sole custody, without understanding what that means. So I think that's one of the key takeaways, is just be careful with your words when you haven't been educated about what those words mean in the legal context. And then the last thing I would just share is, I had a client who decided a letter to their spouse was really the best way to communicate that he wanted the divorce. And this was something I had never seen, and I was, uncomfortable with it. But the reality was, he said, she won't let me leave, and my family won't let me leave the marriage. And the only way to leave this marriage, and they had no children, and they didn't own the home. So all the issues that we worry about with people leaving were not in the equation. And he said, I just need to communicate it with the letter. So he wrote the letter. It was fine, but then at the end, he added in, and you can keep X, Y, and Z assets. You can keep this. I'm leaving. And so we spent the next 6 months of the negotiation trying to walk back what he had put into this letter. And so I think it's another example of maybe a letter is the move. Maybe that's the dynamic in your relationship. I mean, think about it, talk to an attorney about it, but be very careful if you to misrepresent your expectations in the conversation, right? So you don't be careful about words, and don't make promises that you're not sure you're going to be able to keep once the conversation continues. So it's a recipe, I think, for disaster. Anything else? We do have another question. It's a little bit outside of the scope, but I'm planning to amend our family trust to say that in case of children's divorce, this trust is not to be treated as their marital property. Is that a good idea? So I'm going to sort of spin it a bit in the context of our conversation. And so, this is a complicated issue. Trusts and how they work into marital property concepts is complicated. I think this is a conversation that you should have with your child about what that means and how best to protect those assets. Maybe this is a prenup situation as well. Is there anything anyone wants to add?
So the only thing that I would add, and I get a lot of questions. So it's oftentimes when parents are creating trusts for their kids, one of the concerns is, what if they get divorced, right? I want to protect them against that, right? And the other side, and then they have to go and explain to their kid or their child why they're holding assets in trust, right? And why they're potentially not letting their spouse partake in it, right? If the child passes away, the initial thought is, oh, I want my spouse to be able to, use that money to take care of our kids, for example. And so I think that there are ways to talk about that scenario. And one of them is, putting it on and saying that, this is allowing you to care for your grandchildren or your children. So I think that there are important conversations around why assets are held in trust for kids, if that answers the question at all.
Okay. I think we're gonna conclude. So I guess the main takeaways here, if I have the right to some closing comments here, is that these are uncomfortable conversations, but timing and sort of thinking about the timing can really make a difference. And recognizing that you can't accomplish everything in one conversation. So maybe setting limited goals, planning the conversation out in your mind to the extent you can, role play with someone, engage a friend in working through the conversation with you. And I think the key takeaway is a lot of these conversations require guidance from professionals in advance of having them and while you're planning on having them. And so I think that that's got to be a starting point for many of these things. Is there anything anyone wants to add?
I would just like to add that you should be patient with yourself, that these are really difficult things to broach, and that broaching them is an act of bravery. And it's an act of bravery on the other person's part to be able to engage as well. So, lead with love and kindness as best you can. I mean, even in a divorce, at some point, you probably love the other person, and you hope, you may have made children together. And so it's easier said than done, but I really can't emphasize that enough. Like, breathe, try to lead with love and kindness, and be patient with yourself and the other person. You'll get a better outcome.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And if you have any other questions, you can always reach out to any one of us. Our contact information, again, is on the Rower website. And have a good evening.
Thank you, Dilly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.